The 22-year-old mechanics at QuickLube didn't just mock 67-year-old Tony for being slow. They called him Grandpa and joked about putting him in a nursing home. But when the $300,000 Ferrari broke down and Tony fixed it with his bare hands in 10 minutes, the owner's face went white. He was staring at the engineering legend who had built every engine that made Ferrari famous. Bay 3 at QuickLube looked like any other oil change station, but the man working there wasn't like any other mechanic. Tony Marcelli moved slowly, his 67-year-old hands showing the tremor of age. The young crew treated him like a liability. What they didn't know was watching them. Those weathered fingers had once crafted the most powerful engines in racing history. The man they called useless had revolutionized Formula One engineering. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was just the old guy who couldn't keep up. Until a red Ferrari 488 pulled into his bay, and everything changed forever. Welcome to Still Human, where the greatest legends sometimes hide behind the humblest uniforms. If you believe that genius deserves respect regardless of age, hit subscribe. These stories of hidden mastery need witnesses. Before we dive into Tony's incredible story, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And have you ever witnessed someone being dismissed because of their age? Now, let's see what happens when automotive royalty meets minimum wage reality. QuickLube station number 47 sat between a McDonald's and a tire shop on Route 9 in suburban Detroit, Michigan. It was the kind of place that promised 15-minute oil changes and employed mostly young mechanics who knew enough to drain oil and replace filters, but not much more. Tony Marcelli had been working there for 8 months, ever since his wife Maria passed away, and he'd needed something, anything, to fill the empty hours. At 67, with silver hair that had once been jet black and hands that showed the wear of decades working with metal and machinery, he looked like exactly what he was, an old man trying to stay useful. The day shift crew was typical for a chain oil change shop. Derek Martinez, 23, the assistant manager who took every opportunity to remind everyone of his authority. Jake Thompson, 22, who spent more time on his phone than under car hoods. Marcus Williams, 21, fresh out of community college with a basic automotive certificate and an attitude that suggested he knew everything about cars. To them, Tony was an anachronism. He moved slowly, asked questions about car models they'd never heard of, and insisted on doing things the old way, instead of following the streamlined corporate procedures that prioritized speed over precision. What none of them knew was that Tony Marcelli wasn't just any old mechanic. He was Antonio "Tony" Marcelli, former chief engineer for Scuderia Ferrari's Formula One team, the man whose innovations had powered more championship wins than any other engineer in racing history.
But that life felt like a dream now. After Maria's death, the racing world's glamour had turned to ash. He'd quietly retired, sold his house in Maranello, Italy, and moved to Detroit to be near his daughter. The job at QuickLube wasn't about money. His Ferrari pension was more than generous. It was about having somewhere to go, something to do with hands that still remembered the feel of precision engineering. The harassment started on Tony's second week. It began as harmless jokes about his age and escalated into systematic humiliation. "Hey, Grandpa," Derek called out during the morning briefing. "Try to keep up today. We're not running a retirement home here." The other mechanics laughed. Tony said nothing, just nodded and went to his assigned bay. Marcus had taken to timing Tony's oil changes with his phone. 12 minutes for a basic change? Dude, my grandmother could work faster than that. "Maybe we should get your grandmother," Jake added. "She'd probably be an upgrade." Tony's methodical approach to each car, checking belts, examining filters, testing fluid consistency, was seen as inefficiency rather than expertise. When he pointed out potential problems to customers, Derek would step in. "Don't mind Tony," Derek would say with a patronizing smile. "He means well, but he's from a different era. We use computer diagnostics now, not guesswork." The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Patterson brought in her Lexus for routine maintenance. Tony noticed immediately that her brake fluid was contaminated and her rotors were showing dangerous wear patterns. "Ma'am," Tony said politely, "I think you should have your brakes checked. The fluid is—" "Tony," Derek interrupted sharply, "we're here for oil changes, not brake jobs. Don't try to upsell customers." Mrs. Patterson looked confused. "But if there's a safety issue—" "There's no safety issue," Derek assured her. "Tony sometimes sees problems that aren't there. It comes with age." Tony watched Mrs. Patterson drive away on brakes that wouldn't last another 1,000 miles, knowing that Derek's arrogance could cost someone their life. That afternoon, Derek gathered the crew around Tony's bay. "Guys, we need to talk about productivity. Corporate's been asking questions about our numbers, and frankly, Tony's dragging us down." Marcus grinned. "Maybe it's time for the nursing home, Grandpa." "I'm not going anywhere," Tony said quietly. "Look, old man," Derek said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone drunk on minor authority. "This isn't the 1970s. Cars are computers now. You can't just listen to engines and pretend you know what's wrong." Jake laughed. "Yeah, what's next? Reading tea leaves to diagnose transmission problems." Tony felt something cold settle in his chest. These boys had no idea what they were talking about. He'd been designing engines when their fathers were still children. But arguing would only make things worse.
The systematic harassment intensified over the following weeks. Derek seemed to take personal pleasure in humiliating Tony in front of customers and coworkers. When Tony suggested that a customer's BMW needed a coolant flush based on the color and consistency of the fluid, Derek loudly announced, "Don't listen to Tony. He thinks every car needs expensive repairs. It's probably just anxiety from working with technology he doesn't understand." The customer, a young professional, looked at Tony with pity. "It's okay, sir. I know this must be hard for you." Tony wanted to explain that he'd forgotten more about automotive engineering than Derek would ever learn, but what was the point? He just nodded and returned to his work. Marcus had started filming Tony during particularly difficult tasks, posting videos on social media with captions like, "When QuickLube becomes elder care," and "Proof that mandatory retirement should exist." The other mechanics found it hilarious. Tony found it heartbreaking. The worst incident came when a customer brought in a vintage 1965 Mustang for routine maintenance. Tony's eyes lit up as he examined the classic V8 engine, a design he knew intimately from his early days in automotive engineering. "Beautiful car," Tony told the owner, a middle-aged man named Frank. "Original 289 Windsor block. They knew how to build engines back then." Frank's face brightened. "You know these old engines?" "A little," Tony said modestly. Before he could say more, Derek appeared. "Frank, right? Don't mind Tony. He likes to pretend he's an expert on vintage cars. Truth is, we had to explain to him how modern fuel injection works last week." Frank's expression cooled. "Oh, well, just the oil change then." Tony watched Derek destroy what could have been a wonderful conversation about automotive history, about the evolution of engine design, about the artistry that went into those classic power plants. Instead, he was reduced to a confused old man who didn't understand fuel injection. The humiliation was complete when Derek assigned Tony to clean the shop's bathroom during his lunch break. "Toilet duty for Tony," Derek announced. "Seems more his speed." As Tony scrubbed toilets with hands that had once assembled engines worth millions of dollars, he wondered if he'd made a mistake coming here. Maybe he should just quit, retreat to his apartment, and wait to die like so many of his contemporaries. But then he thought about Maria, about her last words encouraging him to keep building, keep creating, keep sharing his knowledge with the world. He wasn't ready to give up yet. The transformation began on a Friday afternoon when a Ferrari 488 GTB rolled into Tony's bay. The $300,000 supercar drew immediate attention from the entire crew, but Tony felt something deeper than admiration. He felt recognition. The car's owner, David Chen, was a successful tech entrepreneur in his 40s who collected exotic cars. He'd been driving from Chicago to Toronto when his check engine light came on. It started making a weird noise about 50 miles back. David explained to Derek, "Just want to make sure everything's okay before I continue the drive." Derek's eyes lit up at the prospect of impressing the owner of such an expensive vehicle. "Absolutely, sir. We'll run full diagnostics. Jake, hook up the computer." Jake connected the diagnostic scanner, but the readout showed no clear error codes. "Everything looks normal on the computer," he announced. "But the noise is still there," David said, starting the engine. The Ferrari's V8 emitted a subtle, irregular rhythm that was barely audible over the normal engine sounds. Derek listened for a moment and shrugged. "Sounds fine to me. These supercars are temperamental. Probably just needs premium gas." David looked skeptical. "It's a $300,000 engine. I'd rather be sure." Marcus stepped forward, eager to impress. "Sir, I've worked on lots of high-performance cars. Sometimes owners think they hear problems that aren't really there." Tony had been watching from his bay, his trained ear immediately identifying the issue. The subtle irregularity in the engine's rhythm indicated a timing chain tensioner that was beginning to fail, a problem that could destroy the entire engine if not addressed quickly. "Excuse me," Tony said quietly, approaching the group. Derek shot him a warning look. "Tony, we've got this handled. The timing chain tensioner is failing," Tony said simply. Everyone turned to stare at him. Marcus laughed. "Timing chain tensioner? Dude, you can't even diagnose that without opening the engine." "I can hear it," Tony said. "Left bank, approximately 15 degrees advance from optimal timing. The tensioner spring is losing compression." David Chen's expression changed. As a successful entrepreneur, he'd learned to recognize expertise when he heard it. "Are you sure?" Before Tony could answer, Derek stepped between them. "Mr. Chen, please don't listen to Tony. He's been having some issues with distinguishing reality from fantasy. We think it might be early dementia." The words hit Tony like a physical blow. Derek had just publicly diagnosed him with dementia to discredit his professional assessment. David looked uncomfortable. "I see. Well, maybe I should just continue driving and—" "No," Tony said firmly. His voice carried an authority that made everyone freeze. "Don't drive this car another mile. That tensioner will fail completely within 50 miles, and when it does, the timing chain will destroy your pistons, your valves, and possibly crack your engine block. You'll be looking at a $50,000 repair instead of a $500 fix." The absolute certainty in Tony's voice cut through the mockery. David studied the old mechanic's face and saw something that made him reconsider. Derek started to protest, but Tony was already moving. "Just need to remove the timing cover, 20-minute job." Against Derek's loud objections, David nodded. "Do it." What happened next was like watching a master craftsman return to his element. Tony's hands, which had seemed slow and uncertain during routine oil changes, moved with surgical precision. He removed the timing cover with movements so economical and sure that even Marcus stopped laughing. When the timing chain assembly was exposed, the problem was immediately visible. The tensioner spring was compressed beyond its design tolerance, and stress fractures were visible on the mounting bracket. "Jesus," David whispered. "You could see that just by listening?" Tony nodded. 40 years of experience. But as he reassembled the engine with replacement parts David authorized from the Ferrari dealership down the street, something extraordinary began to happen. Tony's movements were poetry in motion, his understanding of the engine's architecture was absolute, and his modifications to improve the factory design were subtle but brilliant. David Chen wasn't just watching a mechanic work, he was watching an artist perform. "Where did you learn to work like that?" David asked quietly. Tony paused, his hands still deep in the Ferrari's engine bay. "I used to work with engines like this." "Where?" Tony met David's eyes. "Maranello." The word hung in the air like a revelation. Maranello, the home of Ferrari's racing division, where only the most elite engineers in the world were allowed to work. David's face went white. "Maranello," David repeated slowly. "You worked at Ferrari?" Tony nodded, his attention still focused on the engine. "Formula One division. Chief engineer for 12 years. Derek laughed nervously. "Tony, come on, stop making things up." But David Chen wasn't laughing. As a car collector and racing enthusiast, he knew that the Formula One division at Maranello was sacred ground. Only a handful of engineers in history had achieved the position of chief engineer there. "What years?" David asked. 1995 to 2007. Tony replied, making a final adjustment to the timing chain. Michael Schumacher era primarily, then the early Raikkonen years. David's hand started shaking. The Michael Schumacher era was legendary. 5 consecutive world championships, the most dominant period in Formula One history. "Prove it," Marcus said defiantly. "If you're some hotshot engineer, prove it." Tony finished reassembling the engine and started it. The Ferrari purred with mechanical perfection, the irregular rhythm completely gone. But instead of responding to Marcus, he walked to his toolbox and pulled out his phone. "David," Tony said, "what's your email address?" Confused but curious, David provided it. Tony's fingers moved across his phone screen with surprising dexterity for someone supposedly struggling with modern technology. David's phone chimed with an incoming email. When he opened it, his face went completely white. The email contained a link to the Ferrari Formula One official website, specifically to a page titled Engineering Legends, the Architects of Victory. At the top of the page was a photograph of a younger Tony Marcelli shaking hands with Michael Schumacher beside a championship-winning Ferrari F1 car. The caption read, "Antonio Tony Marcelli, Chief Engine Designer, 1995 to 2007, architect of the most successful era in Ferrari Formula One history." Derek snatched the phone from David's hands, his face growing pale as he read. Marcus and Jake crowded around, their laughter dying in their throats. The page detailed Tony's innovations, the revolutionary combustion chamber design that gave Ferrari's engines their legendary power, the lightweight materials he'd pioneered, the aerodynamic cooling systems that allowed Ferrari to run higher performance settings than their competitors. At the bottom of the page was a quote from Michael Schumacher himself. "Tony Marcelli is the most brilliant engine designer I've ever worked with. Every championship we won was built on his genius." Derek's hands were shaking as he handed the phone back to David. This can't be real." David Googled Antonio Marcelli Ferrari on his own phone. Hundreds of results appeared. Technical papers, racing magazines, automotive journals. Photos of Tony with world champions, with Ferrari executives, with the cars that had dominated Formula One for more than a decade. One article from Automotive Engineering Weekly called him the man who made Ferrari fly. Another from Racing Technology Review. Antonio Marcelli's revolutionary designs didn't just win races, they redefined what was possible in automotive engineering. The silence in the garage was deafening. Marcus was the first to find his voice. But you work here, changing oil." Tony looked at him with an expression that was patient but infinitely sad. "After my wife died, I needed something to do with my hands. Cars have always been my language." David Chen was staring at Tony like he was seeing a ghost. "Do you have any idea who you are? You're a legend. You're in the Racing Hall of Fame. Your engines are in museums." "I know who I am," Tony said quietly. "The question is whether it matters anymore." Derek had gone completely silent, the weight of his humiliation settling over him like a physical force. He'd spent months calling a Formula One legend Grandpa, assigning him toilet duty, publicly questioning his mental competence. Jake spoke up nervously. "Tony, we didn't know." "You didn't ask," Tony replied. "You saw an old man and assumed he had nothing to offer." David pulled out his phone again. "I'm calling Ferrari North America right now. They need to know you're here." "Please don't," Tony said. "I'm not ready for that world again." But David was already dialing. 20 minutes later, 3 men in expensive suits arrived at QuickLube station number 47, Ferrari executives who had flown in from Detroit Metro Airport. The lead executive, a man named Roberto Martinelli, approached Tony with something approaching reverence. "Maestro Marcelli," he said in accented English, "we have been wondering where you disappeared to. The company has been hoping you would consider a consulting position." Derek watched in amazement as these powerful men treated his useless employee like automotive royalty. "Your innovations are still being used in our current Formula One cars," Martinelli continued. "The 2024 championship car uses an evolution of your combustion chamber design." Tony smiled sadly. "I'm retired, Roberto. I just want to work with my hands." "But not like this," Martinelli gestured around the oil change bay. "This is beneath your dignity." "No work is beneath anyone's dignity," Tony replied, "but maybe it's time for people to understand what dignity actually means." He turned to Derek, whose face was ashen. "You called me delusional. You suggested I had dementia. You made me clean toilets while telling customers I couldn't be trusted with their cars." Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You filmed me struggling," Tony continued, looking at Marcus, "posted videos mocking my age and experience. You decided my worth based on how fast I could drain oil instead of asking what I might know about automotive engineering." The Ferrari executives looked appalled. Martinelli stepped toward Derek with barely controlled anger. "This man," he said quietly, "has contributed more to automotive advancement than most engineers achieve in a lifetime. His work has influenced every major manufacturer in the world. And you had him cleaning toilets?" The aftermath was swift and decisive. Derek was terminated that afternoon. Marcus and Jake were written up and required to attend sensitivity training. The QuickLube corporate office issued a formal apology and offered Tony any position he wanted within the company. Tony declined. Instead, he accepted a different offer, one that David Chen made as they stood beside the perfectly running Ferrari. "I'm opening a classic car restoration shop," David said. "High-end work, museum-quality projects. I need someone who understands that cars are art, not just transportation." Tony considered this. "I'm 67 years old, and I'm 43, David replied. "Between us, we have over a century of automotive passion. What do you say?" 6 months later, Marcelli Classic Motors opened in a converted warehouse in downtown Detroit. Tony worked on cars that deserved his expertise: vintage Ferraris, classic Porsches, rare American muscle cars whose owners understood they were investing in mechanical artistry. Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychology professor at Wayne State University, featured Tony's story in her research on ageism in the workplace. "What happened to Tony Marcelli happens to thousands of older workers every day," she explained to her students. "They're dismissed, devalued, and disrespected not because they lack competence, but because society has decided their experience doesn't matter." Derek Martinez found a new job at a different oil change chain, but the humiliation of his treatment of Tony followed him. Word had spread through the automotive community about the manager who had humiliated a Formula One legend. David often found him working late into the evening, not because he had to, but because he loved the feel of precision engineering in his hands. "Any regrets about leaving Formula One?" David asked one evening, as Tony fine-tuned a 1967 Shelby Cobra's engine. Tony considered the question. "I regret that it took Maria's death to teach me that real satisfaction comes from doing what you love, not from where you do it. QuickLube taught me that respect isn't about titles or trophies. It's about seeing the person behind the uniform." Ferrari invited Tony back to Maranello for the 2024 season opener, where they honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. He accepted graciously, but returned to Detroit the next day. "The future of automotive engineering is in places like this," he told the automotive press, who had tracked him down. "Not in corporate boardrooms, but in small shops where people still believe cars have souls." The story of Tony Marcelli became a case study in business schools about the hidden costs of ageism. QuickLube Corporation implemented new training programs focused on respecting employee experience regardless of age. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler. In automotive shops across America, younger mechanics began asking their older colleagues about their backgrounds, their experience, their knowledge. Because Tony Marcelli had taught them that the most valuable lessons often come from the people society is quickest to dismiss. Genius doesn't expire at 65. Experience doesn't become worthless because hands move slower or hair turns gray. The most valuable knowledge in any industry often belongs to people who've lived long enough to see patterns that younger workers haven't yet recognized. Tony Marcelli's story reminds us that every person we encounter carries a lifetime of experience, knowledge, and accomplishments that we can't see from their current circumstances. The next time you meet someone working a job that seems beneath their age or education, remember Tony. Remember that the person changing your oil might have once designed the engine in your car, that the elderly clerk at the grocery store might have been a teacher who shaped hundreds of minds, that every person deserves respect not just for who they are, but for who they've been. Have you ever discovered that someone you underestimated had an extraordinary background? Share that story in the comments below. At Still Human, we believe that wisdom earned through experience is the most valuable resource in any workplace. Subscribe for more stories that remind us to look beyond appearances and recognize the hidden expertise all around us. Because sometimes the greatest masters are hiding in the most unexpected places.